I'm going to start on the sort of the deep shallow rig, if you like. I think with the rain, one of the pellets has just sort of eroded off the band there, but we'll just slip another pellet on. Kind of been catching on these bloodworm pellets so far today, so got confidence in those. They're a nice standout bait, so I think we'll try one of those to start off with. But again, just sort of reiterating what I was saying about the fizzing in the peg. As you can see looking out there now, there's very few bubbles, maybe the odd one off the odd skimmer or small fish that's on the bottom. But when we started loose feeding and putting that small pot of bait initially to kick off the peg, there was plenty of fizzing activity on the bottom, so that's where the carp were. As I say, we caught one decent one within sort of a couple of minutes. Had a smaller couple of carp as well that we've not really shown on camera, an F1 little skimmer and that tench as well. But since the fizzing stopped, as I say, we've had loads of indications, seen the odd fish shallow, so then it's important that you do consider just building the peg for another 5 or 10 minutes at that point, and then looking to go on the shallow rigs. So what we'll do is just slap this rig a couple of times just to see if I get a bite initially, and see if there's a carp there responding to the noise of the pellets landing on the surface, because if there are, then I'll immediately pick up the rig that, as I say, is designed sort of for slapping on the surface. If not, what I'll do is just use this rig for a short while and just lay it into the peg. Again, it's not as obtrusive as sort of a slapping rig, where you're going to be making lots of noise and, as I say, waving the pole over the heads. This rig's just sort of laying the rig in, letting it settle, and as I say, fishing it sort of more like a maggot or caster rig, if you like, something that you'll use for silverfish. So you're creating as little disturbance as you can, making a little bit of noise as the pellet and float drops in, but ultimately trying to get that pellet to fall through nice and naturally. As I say, it's fishing at about 3/4 depth. So I'll keep the pellets going in with this rig, and one thing I'll notice how I fish it, it's a bit different to, say, the slapping rig where I'll feed and then start slapping the rig and then let it settle. With this rig, what I'll tend to do is try and keep that pellet as active as possible. It always needs to be falling through the water. So what I like to try and do is disguise it in amongst the loose feed that I'm putting into the peg. So I'll loose feed and then lay the rig in over the top of the feed where I can. Again, just let that settle, and that's why I like to use a float with a bristle as well. Especially on a rig like this, it allows me to read the bites and where that pellet is in the water column. Just tells you a lot more about your peg. Some people just insist that dibbers are the best style of float for this type of fishing. There's a fish on now. It's just dropped off that one. He may have been foul hooked, so I just lifted the rig. I'm saying some people might prefer to use dibbers for this style of fishing, but because the way that I like to fish the rig, it's very similar to sort of maggot fishing, if you like. Yeah, pellet's still on the hook. So I like to just lay that rig in over the top, in amongst the loose feed, and try and sort of disguise the hook bait in and amongst it rather than make it stand out as the only hook bait. Again, also because of the way that I'm actually laying the rig in rather than slapping it, as I've said, it stops you spooking fish that might be really shallow, so it's a very useful rig to have. So you can see there, I'll loose feed a few pellets, get the rig out to the distance that I want to fish, and then what I'll tend to do with this rig, as I say, is put in 5 or 6 pellets into the pouch, feed them, and then just lay the rig over the top, just making a nice light plop, not sort of making any sudden movements with the pole that's going to spook any fish. Then holding that float on a tight line, I can see as that bristle registers as the bait is falling, you can see whether it's settled, and again, as soon as it's settled, I'll just lift the rig out and lay it back in without any feed. And by the time that pellet's settled, I'll have some pellets in the pouch ready to feed, get them into the peg, and just lay the rig back out again like that. As you can see, just by laying the rig in amongst the loose feed, quite often that'll catch the warier fish that are just coming into the feed as it's moving in. They don't want too much noise and they don't want to be disturbed by a pole over their heads. And you can just lay that rig in over the top and nick the odd fish. Again, because we've foul hooked one fish already with this rig, it's telling me that they might be sat a little bit shallower. So it might be the case on a day like this, especially when, as you can see, the weather's already warming up quite quickly. I might not use this rig for more than 5 minutes on other days, especially when it's raining, for example. The temperatures are down a little bit. This is the rig that you'll catch on most of the day. Just going to lay that rig in, let it settle, feed a few pellets, and then lay it back in over the top. can see there, a couple of little pulls on the float. Those are probably roach and rudd attacking the pellet as it's falling. So it also gives you not only a chance to catch the silverfish, but it tells you whether there's a few in the peg as well, does this rig. Just letting that rig settle. Occasionally we'll nick the odd fish, had a bite there off the silverfish, without it going through any loose feed. But what I'll do, as I say, is just loose feed, lay the rig in over the top. Exactly the same thing that you'll see me do on mill ponds and other venues for silverfish with casts. It's the same kind of principle with this rig, hence the strung out shot and laying it in amongst the loose feed. Hopefully, because it's sat at sort of 2.5 foot, like what would effectively be sort of 1/2 to 3/4 depth, if the fish do go down in the water column, I can just pick this rig up and nick the odd fish off that's just dropped down in the water. Get loads of indications still, so I suspect that the fish are slightly shallower now. There's another indication there. Right, so as you can see there, big swirl in front of the float just as I've fed those pellets, so it's showing me that basically there's quite a few fish really high up in the water. Funnily enough, just up to carp now on the sort of the deep shallow rig. But as I've been sort of feeding with this rig and laying it in, I've had plenty of indications again that the fish are still shallower. But because I've seen so many fish swirl, I think we'll probably just call it one fish on this rig, and then we'll get onto that shallower sort of slapping rig, if you like, because that's where the fish seem to be at the moment, is in that much higher up in the water column, I should say. Much smaller fish, this one looks like a little F1 actually. And the hook's just dropped out in the net. Again, not a big fish at all, that one, but again, it shows the value of just having this rig set up. Again, because we've not been slapping the rig in, creating loads of disturbance, those fish will have the confidence to come right up in the water, but we're still able to nick the odd fish like that one. So we'll just get him slipped back, and I think what we'll do is now move on to that much shallower rig. Again, as you can see, the weather conditions are changing all the time, so we could end up back on this rig a bit later on in the session. So when we've caught a few fish shallow and they start to move back down in the water column. But as it stands, because I've seen so many fish swirling up in the water, we'll get this sort of slapping rig on, if you like, and have a go for them that way. Again, like I said earlier, it's important that you do have that pellet on the band so it's ready to go as soon as you do decide to get onto these sort of rigs, saving as much time as possible. Again, there's an odd bit of fizzing coming up now and again. Where the conditions have changed, it's got a bit cooler. That could have pushed the fish down a little bit, and that's why there's a little bit more fizzing on the bottom. And again, this is what I keep saying about having lots of rigs set up, is it means that you do have the options then to go back on the deck should you need to sort of chase the fish through the water column until you get them settled at a certain depth. We'll see if we can get a few bites on this rig. And this is really what we're trying to cover today, try to get onto this rig, and this is hopefully what we'll catch most of the fish on today if we're lucky. And they're happy to feed at this depth. But as I say, we're looking at hard pellet fishing today, and especially shallow, and this is sort of one of the most popular methods that you'll see people use. Personally, it's one of my favourite ways of catching carp, is on a rig like this and slapping the rig. It's a really busy and active method, and the more that you work and the more that you do, basically, ultimately the more fish you'll catch. So I'll quickly explain to you sort of the principles behind it. Again, a couple of indications there as that pellet's falling. I'll try and sort of explain how you go about fishing this sort of slapping rig, if you like. There's a fish on straight away. Felt like a small roach, that actually. The crux of it is basically you're trying to slap the rig on the top of the water to make as much noise as you can, and that comes into several aspects in terms of what you're doing, in terms of flicking the rig over. There's a couple of little things with the rig that I'll mention as well. They're absolutely crucial to make sure you can do this. First of all, I'm trying to create 3 little plops, as you can see, so using a nice small stubby float like the Map S3 that we've got on this rig here. makes a nice little plop, and you'll see as it goes into the water, that makes a little sort of noise. There's the bulk of the 4 number 10s, that's why I bulk them together, is it sort of imitates a pellet going in as well. And then you've got the actual pellet itself, so it's creating effectively a false feed. And what I'll try and explain as I fish this this rig for the next sort of half hour or so is basically how you alternate between your loose feed to create noise and attract fish into the peg, and then almost wean them onto the hook by not feeding and just creating noise using the rig. But basically you're trying to keep that hook bait moving as much as possible. And on certain days you'll need to create as much noise as you can. So loose feed and constantly turning the rig over to try and get the fish into the peg just through creating noise. One thing that's important to consider as well when you are fishing shallow like this and slapping a rig, must have laid it over the top of the back one there. When you're slapping a rig like this is using a Dacron connector, it's absolutely imperative that you use a Dacron. You can't really use a crow's foot or a standard ston foot for this style of fishing, because the line will be liable to wrapping around the pole tip, and especially as you can see with violent takes like that, if you foul hook fish by accident or whatever it'll be, or just the takes in general, then you do run the risk of snapping the top kit, which isn't ideal. So like I say, a Dacron connector is absolutely crucial. And then the only other thing to consider, as I say, because ultimately it is quite a simple method, as long as you've got sort of the rig right and the Dacron connector, the last thing to consider is the length of line between pole float and tip. I like to have it as short as I can get away with, but you need to have it longer than, say, if you're fishing pellets on the deck or other rigs, because you're going to be slapping the rig round quite a lot. So with F1s you might fish a really short line in this method, but for big carp you want to be fishing somewhere between sort of 12 inches to 18 inches, something like that, and that's one on the surface there. See if we can get him to take it. And that just means that you've got plenty of clearance when you're rotating the rig round the top of the pole to lay it down in the water, so as you can see the float, the shot and the pellet all make a little noise, but without the pole tip smashing into the water surface, which, as I say, will ultimately spook fish. So what I'm going to do now is stop feeding for a short while, because there's definitely 1 or 2 fish there. I'm just going to keep turning the rig over, trying to make as much noise as I can with the rig. I've had a go at the float, as you can see, without putting any feed in. So effectively it's giving the fish the impression that, say if I slap the rig 3 times, keep rotating it, it effectively makes it like sort of there's been nine pellets entering the water, when in reality there's only my hook bait there. So hopefully by doing this and cutting out the feed, quite often you can try and wean a fish onto the hook, and especially when you've got a lot of fish in your peg, suddenly cutting out the feed and just slapping the rig can result in a really quick bite. And if it doesn't work, just put a couple more pellets in, and you can always try laying the rig in amongst the pellets again. So it's just a case of sussing out on the day which is the best way to go about sort of tricking the fish effectively into taking your hook pellet. So whether it's going to be a case like that of laying the rig in amongst the feed and disguising it as one of the feed pellets, or just by cutting out the feed entirely, just making as much noise as you can, turning the rig over, and giving them effectively next to no choice other than to take your hook bait. That was a bite immediately. So he cut out the feed, slapped the rig a few times there, and one had it immediately. Again, there's no point trying to keep turning the rig over for say 15-20 minutes without putting any feed in, because ultimately that just won't catch fish. What you do need to do is get some feed in at some point. So it's just trying to work out how often you need to feed to keep the fish in the peg. And then, as I say, the fewer pellets that you're putting in obviously means that the fish have less choice, so they're more likely to take your hook bait. So it's a case of deciding how much you need to feed in terms of pellets to keep the fish in the peg, but making sure that you're not feeding too much so as to effectively mean that you're putting less fish on the hook. That's basically what this style of hard pellet fishing shallow comes down to, is making that decision how much you need to feed and how much you need to turn the rig over. And once you can get into a good rhythm with it, that's when you can really build a really good weight. So getting into a rhythm save, feeding a couple of times. You can see another one right behind it there. Whether you need to feed a couple of times, then slap the rig 5 or 6 times and just wait for a bite for a second before you feed again, or whether it's a case of just putting in, say, 3 or 4 pellets and slapping the rig, say, 10 or 15 times, making as much noise as you can to try and trick the fish. Right, so as you can probably see by the state of my clothing, we've had a sudden downpour for the past sort of 45 minutes to an hour, which has really put the fishing sort of all over the place. What we've done in the meantime, just switching between the few rigs that we've got in terms of sort of chasing the fish up and down in the water column. We've managed to keep a few bites coming over the course of that time, but as per usual, it's put a halt to the filming. So what I'm going to try and do is continue from where we left off if possible. I've kept plenty of bait going in and hopefully the fish should still be quite shallow, so I'm going to start back again on the on sort of the slapping rig, if you like, just on a normal 6mm pellet this time. As you can see as well, because the pellet's got damp, topped up with some fresh ones to make sure that they're all sinking at the correct rate. One thing that I will note as well, while I'm talking about the fact that we've had a sudden downpour, is the fact that when using pellets as loose feed, especially in this state, you want to be fishing them when they, or feeding them, sorry, when they're bone dry, because that means they'll actually sink slower than if they've got a bit of water on them. But as soon as they get damp, they'll sink a lot slower and they won't quite catapult as easily. They'll stick together in mid-air and you'll get too sort of tight of a grouping, which can result in a lot of problems with fish sort of congregating around one tight area, and you'll probably foul hook a few more doing that, basically because they'll congregate in a smaller area. So again, if you can, make sure you try and feed the pellets when they're completely dry. What it also does is, because they're dry, they'll stick in the surface tension for a bit longer as well. Again, just making sure it keeps the fish up off the bottom and as high in the water as you can get them, really. So as I say, we'll try and continue from where we left off using the slapping rig. Before the downpour, I was catching a couple of fish, just sort of feeding 3 or 4 times and then slapping the rig 3 or 4 times, just sort of using sort of a 50-50 split, if you like, between feeding and slapping the rig on the surface. One thing that was apparent, as soon as I stopped feeding, the fish started to move out of the peg a bit too much. But if I was feeding too frequently, there were far too many fish and it's resulting in a lot of missed bites. There was a little roach on that time. As I say, just turning the rig over 3 or 4 times, then feeding a couple of lots of 4 pellets, maybe 5 tops. Not the best feed, you'll see that one, but just repeating that process brought a few bites before we had a sudden downpour, and obviously what that did is push the fish right down in the water, so we ended up fishing on the deck for a bit, catching a couple of fish like that, and using sort of that deep shallow rig as well to pick off a couple. So again, just feeding a couple of lots of pellets, then slapping the rig and letting it settle. As I say, because of the rain, not being able to get into a consistent rhythm of it, bit of an indication there. Right, there's another fish on now. As you can see, I didn't actually feed that time there. Just left it for a couple of seconds, slapped the rig, and that one had it immediately. It's as if there was almost a fish waiting for it. Again, while I'm playing this fish, just going to feed a couple of lots of pellets. As you can see, he's gone a bit mad and shot off right round to my left. So I'm just bringing the fish back. I'm just going to feed a couple of times. to make sure that there's still a few fish in that area of the peg and they're occupied, waiting for pellets to come in. Again, that's the good thing about using a nice soft elastic like this yellow bungees, it's really forgiving. So it's dead easy then just to ship down onto, say, your top 5 like this, putting in another few pellets, as I say, just pretty much lining up the next fish and keeping that level of competition up. As I've said before, I'm not going to feed soil while I'm playing the fish on the top kit, purely because of the amount of snags under my feet, so I want to make sure that I am getting all these fish out without them smashing me up in the roots to my right and under the platform staging that I'm sat on. See, putting up a really good fight, these fish. Well, like I say, after that downpour, I'm quite surprised I've gone straight onto this rig, and within probably 2 minutes I've had a bite straight away. So I started off by feeding a few pouchfuls of bait, trying to get a bit more activity in the peg. Just cut out the feed and this one's nailed it. Could be a slightly bigger fish, this one, actually. Again, and hopefully, as you can see, the weather's turned quite nice now. The temperature's coming up a bit more. With any luck, we might be able to get onto that sort of mugging rig with the Garblino P float, fishing just a hook length deep and trying to sort of mug the odd fish if possible. Which I wouldn't be surprised if I do start to see signs of fish like right under the surface, especially when the temperatures are up like this. So as long as I keep a few pellets going in, hopefully we might get a chance to use that rig. Whereas earlier on with the cloudy conditions and the rain, it didn't look like we'd get a chance to use it. Again, decent stamp fish, this one. And there he is in the net. Really nice sized common, that one. So we'll get the hook nicked out of him, see if we can hold him up for the camera. See, perfect hook hold, sorry, right in the corner of the mouth. It's never coming off, that one. So get the rig popped to one side and see if we can hold him up for camera. See, lovely condition, this fish. Gorgeous colours on him. Nice common, about sort of 2.5, 3 pounds, something like that. Really good stamp fish to catch. Shallow on the pole with hard pellets. So we'll get him popped back and hopefully we'll have a couple more on this rig at this depth. Right, so while I've been out the water, I've just seen a couple of carp, decent size as well, swirl really close to the surface. So what I'm going to quickly do is try this mugging rig, or the sort of the shallowest rig. I'm not sure really what to class it as, but as I say, it's something that I would use if I was mugging carp off the surface. As you can see, nice long length of lines I've explained earlier above the float to make sure that the carp aren't going to be spooked by the pole tip. And dead simple with the little P float to make a nice little plop as it goes into the water, and just the hook length. One thing that you will quite often use when you say mugging fish off the surface or just under the surface, especially in the height of summer, is you can use meat or say sort of wafters or boilies, if you like, to try and get the fish's attention, a bigger target bait that's especially going to fall slower if possible than a normal pellet. But as I say, today we're just covering hard pellets, so we're going to try and run through how to use them on this kind of rig. As I say, because you're trying to sort of attract the fish to one hook bait, I do prefer to use a nice bright hook bait, something like one of these red pellets or one of the krill pellets, as opposed to the actual feed pellets, just something a bit different that can swing towards the fish that's shown. So I'll get this shipped out and just see if there's a fish sat really shallow and see if we can nick one on it. Again, it's not a rig that's going to do the sort of the most damage today, if you like, purely because the temperatures aren't high enough. But especially when the temperatures are really high in the middle of summer, say when it's sort of 25 up to 30 degrees, a rig like this can be absolutely invaluable and quite often the only rig that you'll catch on all day. So it's exactly the same principle to the rig that I've just been using, sort of the slapping rig. Especially when you're using it in conjunction with loose feed like we are here. You're flicking the rig over the top to make a nice little plop, and that little sort of pea float really does imitate a 6mm pellet very well. So it's not the same sort of noise or creates the same level of disturbance as a much bigger sort of 4x10s float crashing in. And equally, because it's pretty much a self-cocking float apart from one number 10 shot that I just used to pimple it down a little bit more. That's one on now. I was just about to lift the float there and flick it out, but what I was going to say is it almost acts like a self-hooking rig because it's dotted right down. As soon as the fish grab it really shallow, they're going to bolt down and hook themselves, just like that one did. Again, you can see how violent the bites are. And it shows just how shallow the fish are coming now. I probably took the bait when it was about 6 inches down, something like that. And quite often on this rig it will sort out the bigger stamped fish as well, which is why I've beefed up the elastic to a 8/8, just to have a bit more control. And again, because I'm using a slightly longer line between float and pole tip, and I want to accentuate that bolt effect, that's why I'm using a doubled up solid rather than a hollow elastic on this rig. But the other thing I was going to point out this rig's very useful for is just swinging out to fish that you can see, because it's a nice sort of heavy small float, if you like, with a wire stem. You can just flick it out to fish that you can see as well. So it's a really versatile little rig. Again, that looks like a decent stamped fish, this one. Nice common. And hopefully it'll be hooked right in the top lip. And he is pretty much right in the top lip. That's where you want to be hooking the fish on this rig. I say because, especially with carp, they do tend to feed slightly deeper than normal. What they'll do is they'll come up, grab the bait and go down in the water with it. And that's what he's done there and hooked himself. Say, fantastic hook hold and a lovely fish. Again, another 2 or 3 pounds, so not a monster. But hopefully that goes to demonstrate what I was saying about using a nice visual pellet. And as I say, demonstrating this rig a little bit. So again, while he's in the net, just get a few more pellets into the peg. Keep the ducks occupied. And we'll hold him up for camera. Again, decent stamp fish, not a monster, and as I say, the stamp fish in this lake's generally smaller than it is on Cyprio and the front pull, but again, another cracking weight builder. So we'll get him popped back, and hopefully, because we've kept the loose feed going in, there should be a few more of those to catch out there. Again, I'm just going to give it a brief second. The ducks will disturb a few of the carp that are really shallow, but it's always worth just taking a second when it's warming up like this, just to see if you can spot the odd carp that's coming up to take the bait from right beneath the surface. I think what I will do is go back onto that slapping rig actually, and say, because quite often when you do catch a carp that shallow, it will spook the rest of them that are sat really high up in the water. So the other thing as well that I'll note on this rig is that I'm not too fussed about using a particularly colourful pellet or a standout hook bait, if you like. Just try and get hold of a normal 6mm here. Purely because the hook bait is going to be that active that I don't believe the carp have very long to inspect it, so they're basically attacking whatever's dropped into the water. So I think on this rig, as opposed to sort of the mugging rig that we've just used there, and the other sort of deep shallow rig where you're laying the rig in, I think on this rig it's less important to use sort of a standout bait, and you can get away with just using a standard hook pellet. It's exactly the same process. Putting the sections on, getting a bit more loose feed in the peg. So hopefully there should be one waiting when we do get out there. Another point to consider as well when you're fishing on the pole like this is you need to make sure that you are checking the joints whenever you're shipping out to make sure that they've not slipped. So because you're keeping the pole really active slapping the rig all the time, it can quite often loosen the joints up, and especially in a case like this where I'm having to hook the fish and ship back really quickly, sort of throw the pole behind me. You need to make sure that the sections aren't getting too loose so as to fall off and ultimately end up with, say, top 5 or top 6 floating around the lake. It's a really useful thing. There's a fish on straight away. A really useful thing to do is use the actual joint alignment system on the pole. As your reference for that, you'll see how the joint aligners won't line up quite right if the section's slipped or has moved. So you can just use those as a quick reference point to make sure that your sections are all together properly. Again, as you can see, as soon as the sun's come out, the fishing's really picked up well. I think a lot of that's down to how we've kept the loose feed going in while it's been raining. So the fish are still expecting the pellets to be going in, so once the temperature's gone back up, as I say, we've had a couple of fish fishing sort of 2.5 foot deep on that sort of deep shallow rig, as I keep referring to it as. Then as soon as the sun's come out, they've come right up in the water and we're able to catch them on the 2 shallowest rigs. And again, when you've got a lot of fish in your peg, that's when this rig can be really devastating, because, as I say, you can keep making loads of noise as if there's still feed going in, but effectively cut out the pellets that you're putting into the peg. As I've said earlier, effectively just putting more fish on the hook that way. So yeah, not a massive fish, another fish, probably a couple of pound or so. Again, not the best piece of netting you'll see. And there he is in the bag. Another lovely little mirror carp, mint condition. And I'll just slip the hook out, but it's nailed right in the top lip, which is exactly what you want when you're shallow fishing. See if we can just hold him up for camera. Still plenty of life left in him. It's another nice little mirror carp there, as you can see. Probably £1.5, £2, something like that. But again, another fish in the bag. Right, so again, they've just slipped on another 6mm fishery pellet. Like I say, it's just a case of repeating this process over and over again. I think as time's going on with the session, I'm sort of getting an idea of how often to feed now, getting into a good rhythm, feeding a couple of pouchfuls on the way out, slapping the rig over a couple of times, and ideally what you're looking for is the fish to pretty much be on it immediately. So I think there's enough fish in the peg now that are actually taking the pellets that what's happening with the last 2 fish especially. So I've slapped the rig in a couple of times, it's gone almost immediately. And that's ultimately what you're aiming for. That's another one on now. Feels like a smaller fish, this. But that's when you can get into a really good rhythm where effectively you're going out every single time and catching straight away. Could be a roach, this, actually. And it is, even these are having a good go at the 6mm pellets. Nice damp fish, probably a couple of ounces or so. And again, I'm not too worried about catching silverfish and roach and rudd, for example, shallow when I'm fishing on the pole for carp. Especially in a match that obviously keeps adding weight to the net, but what it means is that there's other fish competing. So, as is the way we're pretty much all fishing, once you get a couple of fish in the peg competing, they attract more feeding fish, and as I say, it's just about getting that level of competition up. So again, I've fed a couple of times while I've been putting the sections together. I'm just slapping the rig twice when it goes in and waiting for a bite. If it doesn't go, then pick up the catapult, feed another amount of pellets, slap the rig over it twice. I think especially when the fish start to come really shallow, I don't want to be slapping the rig too much. That was a bite straight away there. Because as I say, I don't want to disturb them by sort of spooking them, slapping the pole over the heads, that kind of thing. One little point to consider as well that I do quite often when I'm fishing shallow for carp on the pole is if I miss a bite, I'll cut out the feed and keep slapping the rig, say 5, 6, 7 times in a row, rather than putting any more loose feed in, just to see if I can tempt that same fish that's had a go at it once to have another go at it. Again, doesn't always work, but it's something to consider doing. Because as I've said, quite often if you're missing a lot of bites fishing shallow, either you're not fishing shallow enough, or there's almost too many fish in the peg, and you're getting false indications. So just by cutting out the feed and slapping the rig more rather than feeding can often turn those missed bites into fish. And there's one on now. Again, really nice sharp bite on the float. And as I said earlier, that's why it's important to use nice thick bristles on the floats, especially hollow bristles. So again, just feeding a little bit more into the peg. Give it sort of 2 pouchfuls at a time, and then getting the fish back onto the top kit. So I've taken 3 pulls of elastic, and that puts the fish pretty much right under the end of the top kit. And you can see just how quickly we've had these past few fish. That's when shallow fishing really is at its best. Is it doesn't take long for the rig to be in the water before the float's under and you've got another fish on. And they don't like the look of the net, these fish. And he's in the bag. So lovely colours on this common this time. Cracking little fish. But he's hooked more in the side of the mouth, so it could well be the case that the fish have come even more shallow. So once he calms down, I'll try and nick the hook out of him. And again, I'll just hold him up to camera. The thing is with this sort of shallow fishing, when you get into a rhythm like this, it is just a case of repeating the same process over and over again. Occasionally you'll have to suss 1 or 2 more things out with regards to the feeding and how much you're sort of cutting out the feed to nick the odd fish. When you're on for a good weight, you should be able to just put the rig in and pretty much have it go straight away. Still very lively. As you can see, that's a lovely common again, 2 or 3 pound, and really good weight builders. So before he kicks again, we'll get him slipped back. Lovely lean fish, that one. I think again we'll go back out on this rig. So both the last 2 fish that we've had on it have just been on a standard fishery 6mm, and that's what I'm saying about not having to concern yourself too much with using a standout bait on this rig. When the fish are smashing into the pellets that high up in the water, I don't think it makes any odds what colour or flavour they are, because they don't get a chance to inspect them before they're going down and, say, getting eaten by roach or rudd, for example. So again, after every fish, I'm just checking the sections. Then once I've put them together, couple more pouchfuls of feed. And one thing you'll notice as well, in the time that I've sort of landed that fish after playing it, I've probably fed 5 or 6, maybe even 7 pouchfuls of bait, all the while I'm playing that fish, unhooking it and then shipping back out. So that's keeping bait going into the peg all the time. Again, hopefully it shouldn't take long to get another one. And the way to think of it is basically, once I've put the rig in like this and given it a couple of slaps on the water, the fish have had 6 or 7 feeds where there's been no rig in the water, there's been no danger of them being caught. So they've had 6 or 7 opportunities to move into an area of feed where there's been a bit of noise and pick up the odd pellet without being hooked. So as soon as I go back in, slap it a few times, it should go under again. Sod's law says it won't this time, That's the sort of principle behind it, why you keep feeding all the while you're playing fish, landing them, unhooking them, etc., and shipping back out. See 1 or 2 swirls there as well. If it carries on like that, when I'm getting indications and not hitting the bites, that's when I'll go back onto that mugging rig and hopefully nick a fish or 2. You can see the swirls behind the float as well. So the fish now, with the sun coming out, have come really shallow. So I'll probably give it another 5 minutes on this or so, try and catch a couple more fish. As I say, hopefully, while I've been fishing with this rig, I've explained basically how it works and the premise behind fishing shallow and slapping the rig on the water. But it could well be the case that to catch a few more fish I need to go onto a rig which creates a little less disturbance, can just gently plop it in and fish really shallow. Seen quite a few fish swirling for the bait and even 1 or 2 sort of swimming past, cruising if you like. As you can see, really sharp bite. That one's had it as soon as the floats hit the water. And that's a silverfish on. Again, interesting the size of silvers you can catch fishing pellets like this. Again, that's a lovely size roach, that. And one thing that I'm not sure whether I forgot to mention at the start of the video was just quickly touch on the spacing of the shot on the rig. In terms of how I like to fish the rig to avoid tangles. As I said earlier, it's basically a principle. You've got your pellet, your shot and your float that make the noise. One thing that I will note is making sure that that pellet can't quite reach above the float. As I said, that if the shot was sort of placed there a couple of inches higher, there's a risk of that pellet looping behind the float and ultimately spinning the float up, and if a carp does take it, it's going to smash the rig. So a useful little thing to just think about is having that pellet just sat at the base of the float, and that's how I like it to fish, to avoid tangles, and ultimately registers the bites a lot better that way as well. Again, anything from that sort of depth upwards is covered by the next rig up. So again, just something that I may have forgotten to point out earlier in the video. Right, so as we've got towards the end of the session now, especially as the day's worn on and the temperatures have warmed up, the sun's come out, the fish have come really high up in the water. So I think for the last sort of half hour or so, we're going to try this mugging rig and try and catch a couple of fish really shallow as we possibly can. Used it a couple of times today and had 1 or 2 fish on it already. Again, that was just sort of mugging the odd one that was swimming past really high up in the water column. But we'll give it a go now, just see if we can get a couple more fish just to sort of round off the session on. So I'm just going to try normal fishery pellet and try slapping this rig to start with, because I've seen quite a bit of activity there, but not so many fish cruising. I'm going to actually use it more of a slapping rig than a mugging rig, if you like. And hopefully this should turn quite a few of the missed bites that we did have into fish. Again, because the temperature's warmed up so much, and especially over there where it's actually directly in the sun, I think the fish have started to come to within sort of 12 inches of the surface or so. Seen quite a few swirls and things like that, so we'll try and get a couple of fish on this to sort of round off the session. But hopefully what we've run through today is a decent sort of guide as to how to go about fishing these hard pellets and fishing shallow on the pull for carp and the odd F1 like we've caught today. Again, it's a fantastic method, and especially this time of year, can put a lot of fish on the bank. But the main thing for me and why I enjoy it so much is it's a really nice active method. You're always doing something, turning the rig over, feeding, and trying to suss out where you can catch the fish in the water column. Still see there's the odd bit of fizzing on the bottom as well. So plug away with this for a bit and just see if those fish will come really shallow. Again, I wouldn't expect it to take too long to get a bite at this rate. Again, just using sort of the same rhythm that I was using earlier. Feeding, slapping the rig a couple of times. Then just letting it settle and just repeating that process. As I said earlier today, it's not been a case today where I've had to cut out the feed. If anything, I've had to put more feed in than I normally would on this method. I think that's just kept the fish in the peg and occupied for a bit longer, but it's also meant that I've missed a few more bites. As I say, I've had the level of competition quite high. Cutting out the feed every so often's put a couple of fish on the hook. But mainly it's been about keeping that bait going in and trying to keep the fish off the bottom, if you like. I think today with the changeable weather, they've been up and down all over the place really. So we've had to use all the different rigs to catch the odd fish. We've only caught one on sort of like the deep shallow rig on camera, but we did have a couple when it was raining on that as well. And then picking this rig up, as and when we've seen one or two fish cruising past or swimming really shallow, swirling for pellets, that's nicked a couple of fish as well. But the bulk of the fish have either come on the deck early or on sort of the slapping rig, where they've responded to the noise, and as I say, that's where being able to cut out the feed and catch a few fish in really quick succession. And there's one on now. I think if we get this one in, we'll hopefully call that the last one of the session. Really nice positive bite there. Barely have to lift the pole to hook the fish. Again, not a massive fish this time, but pretty much sort of the average stamp that we've had today, between sort of 2 and 3 pounds. I've had a couple bigger and a few small, the odd F1 as well, and even a tench today. That's another nice fish though. Again, if we can get him in, decent little one to end on. See, slightly on the smaller side compared to the others that we've had today, but again, another nice Monkton pulse carp. You can see how his nail's right in the top lip, and that's exactly where you want to be hooking them on this rig. Still full of energy, so we'll get the hook popped out of him and get him slipped back. So we'll get this rig on the top, on the roost, and just quickly have a little review of what we've done today. Pretty much apart from the rain, I have to say that the session's pretty much gone to plan. We started off just potting in, say, a pot full of sort of 50, 60 6mm pellets, and just fishing that out over the top with a deck rig. Loose feeding over the top. We've then got the fish coming shallower and shallower to effectively finish off fishing sort of 10 inches deep on that mugging rig, if you like. And that's pretty much how we intended the session to go today. Apart from the rain that sort of made things difficult halfway through and pushed the fish down, we've kept on with the feeding and got the fish back up to the top layers where we've ended up catching a decent stamp. And as I say, hopefully it's giving you a good idea of how to go about approaching a peg like this, fishing shallow with hard pellets, and equally doing a bit of fishing on the deck as well. So as I say, get out there yourself, grab a bag of 6mm pellets, dead simple way of fishing, dead cheap. And hopefully if you set up a couple of rigs like we've used today, you should be able to put plenty of carp on the bank and a few other species as well. So as always from Last Cast, thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on that next episode.